The air was thick with the scent of iron and scorched earth. On the edge of the Milky Way's outer arm, Earth had become a wasteland. The war wasn't of their making. Humanity had merely been caught in the crossfire of galactic powers far older and stronger than themselves. Yet, despite centuries of spacefaring knowledge, humans were still called savages by their so-called allies, the Elethran Dominion, a proud race of beings with shimmering metallic skin and an air of unearned superiority. But today, things were different. Standing amidst the debris of what was once Tokyo, Colonel Mara Voss scanned the horizon with tired eyes. The sleek silhouettes of Elethran ships loomed overhead, their shimmering hulls reflecting the dying light of Earth's crimson sunset. "They called us primitives," she muttered under her breath, clutching the rifle that had become an extension of her arm in these last, desperate months. Behind her, the remnants of humanity's military forces were huddled in clusters. Engineers tinkered with makeshift weapons. Medics worked tirelessly to stabilize the injured, and scouts returned with grim reports of advancing threats. The enemy wasn't the Elethrani, not this time. Instead, it was something far worse. The Graith, an ancient and relentless hive species that consumed everything in its path. The Elethran commander, Sareth Althanar, approached Mara, his movements fluid and deliberate. His expression was unreadable, but his tone was unmistakably dismissive. "Colonel Voss," he said, his voice smooth as polished steel, "your people's efforts are valiant, but they lack sophistication. Allow us to handle this incursion." Mara suppressed the urge to roll her eyes. "Handle it?" she snapped. "Your advanced tactics and weaponry haven't exactly stopped the Graith from devouring entire planets, have they?" Sareth's nostrils flared, but before he could respond, a deafening roar split the air. Mara instinctively ducked as a Graith warship broke through the clouds, its chitinous exterior bristling with organic weaponry. The Elethran forces sprang into action, their crystalline rifles firing beams of light that barely scratched the surface of the incoming monstrosity. "Fall back!" Sareth ordered his troops, the panic in his voice betraying his composed facade. "Hold the line!" Mara shouted to her own soldiers. "We've got one shot at this!" She barked orders into her comms. "Hector, light it up!" From a nearby rubble-strewn ridge, a team of human engineers activated a hastily assembled electromagnetic launcher. The makeshift weapon hummed with power as its capacitors charged to the brink. With a thunderous crack, it fired a massive improvised projectile, a salvaged piece of Elethran ship hull infused with Earth-engineered explosives. The projectile struck the Graith warship dead on, its organic armor shattering like glass before erupting into a blinding fireball. The blast was so intense that even the Elethran soldiers, who had dismissed humanity as crude barbarians, paused to watch in stunned silence. Sareth turned to Mara, his expression unreadable once again. "That was unexpected," he admitted begrudgingly. Mara smirked, though there was no humor in it. "Savages, remember?" Before Sareth could reply, another scout came running. "Colonel, the Graith are regrouping. They'll hit us again in 15 minutes. Mara turned to Sareth, her tone sharp. "So, Commander, are you going to keep underestimating us, or are we actually going to work together this time?" Sareth hesitated. For the first time, there was a flicker of doubt, perhaps even respect, in his metallic eyes. "Very well," he said. "Let us see what your resourcefulness can achieve." As they began preparing for the next wave, Mara felt the weight of the moment. Earth's survival, and perhaps the galaxy's, depended on the so-called savages proving their worth to a universe that had written them off long ago. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, the fight felt balanced. For now, Mara's boots crunched against shattered glass as she paced through the temporary command center, a half-collapsed subway station reinforced with steel plating and scavenged alien tech. The air inside was thick with tension. Human soldiers and engineers whispered among themselves, their eyes darting toward the Elethran delegation standing apart, their shining forms like cold, unfeeling statues amidst the grime of human resilience. "Colonel Voss," Commander Sareth said, stepping forward, his polished armor reflecting the faint flicker of emergency lights. "Your people's methods are unconventional, but effective. However, this alliance will only succeed if you heed my orders. Mara stopped pacing, planting her hands on the makeshift table that served as their tactical display. The holographic projection of the battlefield flickered weakly, highlighting the advancing Graith swarms. "Let's get one thing straight," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "This isn't your show anymore. Your tactics haven't worked, and your arrogance nearly cost us Tokyo. We'll do this my way, or we won't do it at all." The Elithran officers bristled, their expressions tightening in perfect unison. Sareth's metallic features remained stoic, but there was an edge to his voice when he replied, "Your way involves primitive weapons and—" "Surviving," Mara interrupted. "My way involves surviving. Something your kind seems to be struggling with." Before the argument could escalate, a loud crackle came over the comms. "Colonel," a voice said, urgency clear. "We've got movement on the western perimeter. They're massing again." Mara glanced at Sareth, then back at the hologram. "Great. Another chance for us savages to save the day." On the western front, the Graith swarms were as horrifying as ever. Miles of glistening insectoid creatures moving with a hive mind's precision. Their war beasts, towering creatures with jagged exoskeletons and acidic breath, advanced behind them, creating a nightmarish wall of death. Mara stood at the front line. Her soldiers spread out along barricades made of rubble and reinforced steel beams. The Elithran forces took positions above, their crystalline rifles trained on the horizon. Despite their disdain for humanity, even they couldn't deny the necessity of this fragile alliance. "This is madness," one of the Elithran soldiers muttered to his comrade, his voice barely audible over the growing hum of the Graith advance. "It's survival," snapped one of Mara's engineers, overhearing. "Get used to it." The Graith surged forward. "Hold!" Mara shouted, her voice carrying above the chaos. "Wait for the signal." Elithran energy weapons began to fire, streaks of light slicing through the advancing swarm. Some Graith fell, but for everyone that died, 2 more took its place. Their sheer numbers overwhelmed the battlefield, their grotesque forms closing the gap with terrifying speed. "Now!" Mara yelled. A series of explosions ripped through the swarm as human-engineered mines detonated, sending fragments of Graith chitin flying through the air. The swarm faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. Mara's forces opened fire, their bullets tearing through the chaos with brutal efficiency. "Move the artillery up," Mara called, her voice strained as she ducked beneath a Graith projectile, a spiny, organic missile that melted everything it touched. "We need more coverage on the left flank." To her surprise, Sareth joined her on the battlefield, his crystalline blade cutting down a leaping Graith drone with a precision that was almost elegant. "Your tactics lack refinement," he said between strikes, "but they are effective." "Was that a compliment?" Mara asked, firing her rifle at a charging war beast. The explosive-tipped round struck true, and the creature collapsed in a heap of broken limbs. "Don't get used to it." The battle raged for hours, the front line shifting back and forth. Humans and Elithrans fought side by side, their differences momentarily forgotten in the face of a common enemy. The air was thick with smoke, the ground slick with blood, both alien and human. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, the Graith retreated. Cheers erupted from the human lines, though they were tempered by exhaustion and loss. "We did it," one soldier muttered, leaning against a barricade for support. "We actually held them. For now," Mara said, though there was no mistaking the pride in her voice. She turned to Sareth, who stood silently, his armor splattered with Graith ichor. "You fought well. Better than I expected." Sareth inclined his head, his expression unreadable. "As did you." Mara didn't have time to savor the moment. Another scout approached, his face pale. "Colonel, you need to see this." The scout led Mara and Sareth to the top of a nearby ridge. From there they could see the full scale of the Graith threat. Thousands upon thousands of the creatures, stretching as far as the eye could see. Their retreat hadn't been a defeat. It had been a regrouping. "They're testing us," Sareth said quietly. "Learning our weaknesses." Mara's jaw tightened. "Then we'll teach them something else." Sareth glanced at her, his metallic features softening slightly. Perhaps we underestimated you. Damn right you did, Mara said. But as she looked out over the endless swarm, she couldn't help but wonder if even humanity's ingenuity and resilience would be enough to survive what was coming next. This was only the beginning. The tension in the command center was suffocating. With the Wraith forces looming on the horizon, morale was stretched to its breaking point. Mara stood before a hastily assembled group of humans and Elithrans, her voice steady despite the weight of their situation. The Wraith aren't retreating, they're watching, she said, pointing to a holographic map flickering on the table. They'll hit us harder, smarter, we've bought time, but not much. Sareth stood opposite her, arms crossed, his polished demeanor unshaken. Then you must trust our advanced weaponry. Our void cannons can annihilate entire swaths of the swarm. Mara sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. Your void cannons, she said, her voice heavy with sarcasm. Overheat and fail after 3 shots. We don't need flashy. We need reliable. The debate threatened to spiral into yet another round of bickering when a loud metallic clang echoed through the chamber. Hector, one of Mara's best engineers, dropped a massive device onto the table. This, he announced, gesturing to the cobbled-together contraption, is a pulse detonator, built it using parts scavenged from their fancy Illithran tech. He smirked at the gathered aliens, earning glares from several. It won't just kill the Wraith, it'll disrupt their hive communications. Confuse the hell out of them. Sareth arched a silvery eyebrow. Primitive, crude, dangerous. Effective, Mara countered, already calculating how to deploy the device. If we plant it at the swarm's central node, we might force them to scatter. Sareth shook his head. A suicide mission. No one would survive. Mara's face hardened. Someone will have to. Otherwise, this war is over. A heavy silence followed. Then, a voice broke through the tension. I'll go. The room turned toward the speaker. It was Corporal Jackson, a scrappy soldier with a scar running across his cheek, a reminder of the battles they'd barely survived. His hand rested firmly on his rifle, his gaze unwavering. Mara stepped closer, her expression softening. You sure, Jackson? This isn't just dangerous, it's damn near impossible. Jackson smirked, a glint of determination in his eyes. Someone's got to show these shiny bastards what humans are made of. Sareth's voice cut through like a blade. Foolish bravery will accomplish nothing. Then it's a good thing we humans specialize in impossible odds, Jackson shot back, earning a ripple of approval from the human soldiers. Before the tension could erupt, Mara raised a hand. Enough, she said, looking at both sides. This isn't about ego. This is survival. If anyone else is volunteering, we'll need a small team. Volunteers only. Hector stepped forward, followed by 2 other soldiers and, to everyone's surprise, an Illithran warrior, tall and stoic, her silver skin shimmered under the dim light. I am Kalis, she said simply. If this mission is to succeed, you'll need my skills. Sareth turned to her, his tone sharp. You would risk your life for them. Kalis met his gaze without flinching. If we fail, Illithran lives will fall with theirs. Pride will not save us. For a moment, Sareth said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, with a curt nod, he conceded, May your courage not be wasted. Under the cover of night, the team moved toward the Wraith hive node, a pulsating, grotesque mass of organic material at the heart of the enemy formation. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the ground squelched beneath their boots. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound a potential threat. Stay low. Mara's voice crackled softly over their comms. You've got one shot at this. Jackson led the way, his grip tight on the detonator. Behind him, Hector carried additional charges, while Kalis moved with silent precision, her crystalline blade ready. The team was a strange mix of human grit and alien grace, but there was no room for doubt now. As they neared the node, the sound of the hive grew deafening, a constant chittering that reverberated in their bones. The Wraith swarmed in and out of the massive structure, their movements a terrifying display of unity. Jackson paused, raising a fist to signal the team to stop. There it is, he whispered, pointing to the node's central core. a glowing orb of bioenergy protected by thick layers of chitin. Kayla stepped forward, scanning the perimeter with a practiced eye. The defenses are formidable. We'll need to draw them away. I can rig a diversion, Hector said, already pulling out a secondary charge. But once I set it, we'll have maybe 2 minutes before they're all over us. 2 minutes is all we'll need, Jackson replied. Let's move. Hector planted the diversion charge 100 meters from the node, setting it to detonate in 60 seconds. The team crouched in the shadows, their breaths shallow as the seconds ticked by. When the explosion came, it was deafening, a brilliant flash that sent Graith drones scurrying toward the noise. Go, Jackson hissed. The team sprinted toward the node, their footsteps muffled by the organic ground. Jackson reached the core first, slamming the pulse detonator into place. Hector began wiring the device while Kayla stood guard, her blade slicing through the occasional drone that strayed too close. Hurry it up, Jackson growled as the chittering grew louder. I'm working as fast as I can. Hector snapped, sweat pouring down his face. Kayla suddenly stiffened. They're coming. The swarm was returning, a tide of skittering horrors bearing down on them. Just a few more seconds, Hector shouted. The first wave hit like a storm. Kalis moved with deadly efficiency, her blade a blur of light as she cut down drones. But it was clear they couldn't hold for long. Jackson fired his rifle in short bursts, each shot taking down a creature, but the swarm was endless. Done! Hector yelled, yanking the last wire into place. Let's go! The team fell back, the detonator's timer ticking down. The Graith were relentless, closing the gap with terrifying speed. One of the human soldiers screamed as a drone dragged him down, his cries silenced in moments. We're not gonna make it, Hector shouted. Keep running, Jackson barked. As they neared the extraction point, Kalis turned, planting herself between the team and the pursuing swarm. Go, she commanded. I will hold them. Jackson hesitated, but Kalis's glare left no room for argument. Make it count, she said, before charging into the fray. The pulse detonator went off moments later, a shockwave of energy rippling through the hive. The Graith froze, their synchronized movements faltering as the node disintegrated. The team watched from the ridge, their breaths ragged. She didn't make it, Hector said quietly. Mara's voice came through the comms. You bought us time. That's what matters. As the hive burned in the distance, Jackson clenched his fists, vowing silently that Kalis's sacrifice would not be in vain. This war was far from over. The victory at the Graith hive node had been short-lived. The pulse detonator had scattered the swarm, buying humanity precious time, but the respite was brief. Reports from scouts flooded in, Graith forces regrouping faster than anticipated, pushing toward critical strongholds across Earth's remaining colonies. In the command center, Mara stared at a holographic map, her jaw tight. Red markers blinked across the display, each one a Graith incursion. They're learning, she muttered. Faster than we expected. They always do, Sareth said, standing behind her. His calm, metallic voice only fueled her frustration. Your victory at the node was impressive, but it will not stop them. The Graith adapt. Mara spun to face him. Then we'll adapt faster. If we sit back and wait for them to strike again, we're finished. I need solutions, not commentary. Sareth raised an eyebrow, unshaken by her anger. Your defiance is admirable, Colonel, but futile. The Graith cannot be defeated by brute force. This war requires precision, strategy, like the kind your people used to lose 3 colonies in the Andromeda cluster. Mara shot back. Yeah, I've read the reports. A ripple of tension passed through the Elithran delegation, their glowing eyes narrowing. Sareth's expression hardened, but before he could retort, Hector burst into the room, his face pale. You're gonna want to see this, the engineer said, holding up a data tablet. He tapped the screen, and an image projected onto the central display, a massive Graith structure floating in low Earth orbit. It was unlike anything they'd encountered before, a grotesque amalgamation of organic and mechanical material, pulsing with a sickly green light. What the hell is that? Mara asked. We're calling it the Void Spire, Hector said. It appeared 3 hours ago, right above the Atlantic. We think it's some kind of command center. All the Graith activity on the surface is being coordinated from there. Sareth stepped closer to the display, his expression unreadable. "A void spire," he repeated, his tone unusually grim. "It's worse than we feared. That structure is not only a command center, it's a birthing vessel. If it is not destroyed, the Graith will overrun this planet within days." Mara's stomach sank. "How do we destroy it?" Hector hesitated. "Well, that's the tricky part. It's heavily shielded. Nothing we've got on the surface can touch it." Mara turned to Sareth. "What about your void cannons? Can they take it out?" Sareth shook his head. "Not in its current state. The spire's organic matrix absorbs energy-based attacks. Even our weapons would be ineffective." "Then we don't use energy-based attacks," Mara said. Her mind was already racing, piecing together a plan. "We hit it from the inside." Sareth blinked, caught off guard. "That would be suicide." "The spire is impenetrable. Not if we can get a team inside," Mara countered. "If we plant charges at the core, we can destroy it from within." Hector frowned. "Even if we could breach the spire, getting close to the core would mean fighting through thousands of Graith drones. We'd need more than just explosives. We'd need a ship capable of withstanding their defenses." Mara turned back to Sareth. "Your ships. Could one of them get us inside?" The Illithran commander hesitated. "Perhaps, but no Illithran would pilot such a mission. It would be a one-way trip." Mara crossed her arms. "Then I'll pilot it myself." The room fell silent. Even Hector looked startled. "Mara, that's insane," he said. "You'd never make it out alive." Mara met his gaze, her expression steely. "We're out of options. If we don't destroy that spire, we lose everything. I'm not asking for volunteers, Hector. I'm telling you, we're doing this." Sareth studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. I will provide you with a ship. But know this, Colonel. If you fail, your people will not survive." Mara's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then I won't fail." Hours later, the mission was underway. Mara and her team boarded the Illithran vessel, its sleek design an odd contrast to the rugged humans now occupying its interior. The ship was outfitted with advanced cloaking technology and reinforced armor, but even that wouldn't guarantee success. Hector adjusted the settings on a console, his fingers flying over alien controls with surprising ease. "This thing is fast, I'll give it that," he muttered. "But if we take even one hit from the spire's defenses, we're toast." "Then we don't get hit," Mara said, strapping herself into the pilot's seat. She glanced back at the team. Hector, 2 other human soldiers, and an Illithran technician named Lyra. "You all know the plan. Get in, plant the charges, get out. No heroics." Lyra tilted her head, her crystalline voice calm. "And if there is no time to get out?" Mara didn't hesitate. "Then we finish the job anyway." The ship's engines roared to life, and within moments, they were airborne. The void spire loomed ahead, its grotesque form glowing against the night sky. As they approached, the spire's defenses came online, organic turrets sprouting from its surface, firing streams of acidic projectiles. "Hold on!" Mara shouted, weaving the ship through the incoming fire. The cockpit shook violently as a near miss sent them spinning, but she managed to stabilize the vessel. "Hector, how's that cloaking system holding up?" "Barely," he replied, frantically adjusting settings. "We've got maybe 2 minutes before they zero in on us." "That's all I need," Mara said, her jaw tight. The ship dove toward the spire, slipping through a narrow gap in its defenses. Alarms blared as they breached the outer shell, the interior of the spire a nightmarish maze of pulsating walls and glowing veins. Mara brought the ship to a rough landing, sparks flying as it skidded to a halt. "Move!" she barked, unbuckling her harness. The team spilled out, weapons at the ready. The air inside the spire was thick and humid, the walls pulsing like a living organism. Graith drones emerged from the shadows, their chittering cries echoing through the corridors. "Stay together!" Mara shouted, firing her rifle at the advancing drones. The team fought their way deeper into the spire, every step a brutal struggle. Lyra's crystalline blade flashed as she cut down drones with precision, while Hector planted charges along the walls. "We're close," Hector called, checking his scanner. The core's just ahead. But as they rounded the final corner, a massive Graith war beast blocked their path. Its hulking form bristled with spikes, its glowing eyes fixed on the intruders. Mara raised her rifle, her heart pounding. Light it up! The battle was far from over, and the odds were growing worse with every passing second. The hulking Graith war beast let out a deafening screech, its limbs bristling with jagged spines that dripped corrosive fluid. It filled the corridor ahead, towering over the team like a nightmare brought to life. Mara steadied her rifle, her mind racing. Split left and right, she barked, her voice cutting through the chaotic echoes of the spire. We need to flank it. Hector and one of the soldiers veered left, while Lyra and the other soldier darted right. Mara stayed in the center, drawing the beast's attention with rapid bursts of gunfire. The rounds sparked against the creature's hardened exoskeleton, barely leaving a mark. It's armored like a tank, Hector yelled over the comms, his voice edged with panic. Nothing's getting through that shell. We don't need to kill it, Mara replied, dodging a swipe from one of the creature's massive claws. Just slow it down. Lyra, do you see any weak spots? From the right flank, Lyra's crystalline voice came through. Its underbelly appears vulnerable, but it is well guarded. Figures, Mara muttered. All right, new plan. Draw its attention up. Get it to rear back. Lyra didn't hesitate. She dashed forward, her blade humming as she leapt onto the beast's leg and drove the weapon deep into its joint. The war beast roared in pain, swiping at her with furious, clumsy movements. Lyra dodged with inhuman grace, her strikes deliberate and precise. The beast reared up, exposing the soft, glowing tissue of its underbelly. Now! Mara shouted. Hector tossed a grenade-like charge to Mara, who caught it mid-air. Without hesitation, she hurled it toward the creature's exposed core. The explosion was deafening, the bright flash momentarily blinding. The beast let out a guttural scream, its massive frame collapsing to the ground with a thunderous crash. It's down! Hector shouted, his voice filled with disbelief. Not for long, Mara said, already sprinting toward the doorway it had been guarding. Move. The core's ahead. The team pressed forward, their boots splashing through the viscous fluid leaking from the spire's walls. The air grew heavier as they neared the central chamber, the pulsating light growing more intense with every step. Finally, they entered the heart of the void spire. The core was a massive, organic sphere suspended in the center of the chamber by thick, sinewy tendrils. It pulsed with green energy, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Around it, clusters of drones worked in mechanical unison, their chittering voices filling the air. Looks like we found the brains of the operation, Hector said, his eyes wide. Mara ignored him, her focus on the core. Set the charges. We blow it all. Hector and Lyra moved quickly, planting explosive devices around the chamber. The drones began to notice, their movements shifting from mechanical to frantic. One by one, they turned toward the intruders, their glowing eyes narrowing. We've got incoming, Mara called, raising her rifle. Hold them off. The room erupted into chaos. The team formed a defensive perimeter, firing into the swarming drones as Hector worked frantically to arm the charges. The drones moved like a wave, their sheer numbers overwhelming. They're everywhere, one of the soldiers shouted, his voice filled with panic. Hold your ground, Mara barked, firing shot after shot. Her arms ached, her vision blurred from exhaustion, but she didn't let up. Lyra fought beside her, her blade flashing like lightning as she cut through the drones with ruthless precision. Hector, Mara yelled. How much longer? 30 seconds, he called back, his hands trembling as he connected the final wires. Make it 20, Mara muttered, slamming a fresh clip into her rifle. A loud screech cut through the chamber as a new figure emerged, another war beast, smaller than the first but faster. It barreled toward the team, its glowing eyes locked on Hector. Watch out, Lyra shouted, throwing herself into its path. The war beast slammed into her, sending her flying across the chamber. She hit the wall with a sickening crunch, collapsing in a heap. No, Mara screamed, but there was no time to grieve. The beast was already turning its attention back to Hector. Mara acted on instinct. She charged forward, firing her rifle in short, precise bursts. The bullets struck the beast's legs, slowing it down just enough for her to reach Hector. She shoved him aside as the beast lunged, its jaws snapping shut where he had just been standing. "Charges are armed!" Hector shouted, scrambling to his feet. "We need to move! Go!" Mara ordered, firing a final shot at the beast before retreating. The team sprinted toward the exit, the drones swarming behind them. As they reached the ship, Hector slammed the hatch shut, his face pale. "We're cutting it close." Mara dropped into the pilot's seat, her hands flying over the controls. The ship roared to life, lifting off just as the first explosion rocked the spire. Through the cockpit window, they watched as the chamber erupted in flames, the core disintegrating in a cascade of light and debris. But the spire wasn't going down quietly. Its outer shell began to collapse, sending massive chunks of debris hurtling toward the fleeing ship. "Hold on!" Mara shouted, weaving through the falling wreckage. The ship shook violently, alarms blaring as a piece of debris grazed their left wing. "We're not going to make it!" Hector screamed. "We'll make it!" Mara growled, her grip tightening on the controls. With one final burst of speed, the ship broke free of the collapsing spire, hurtling into the open sky. Behind them, the spire erupted in a blinding explosion, its glowing remnants raining down like meteors. The team sat in stunned silence, their breaths ragged. Mara glanced back, her heart sinking when she saw Lyra's empty seat. She stayed behind. Hector said quietly. Mara nodded, her throat tight. "She gave us a chance. Let's make it count." As they flew back toward Earth, the ruins of the Void Spire burning in the atmosphere, one thing was clear. The war was far from over. But for now, humanity had dealt the Wraith a critical blow. The ship landed hard in the human stronghold's makeshift hangar, sparks skittering across the floor as the damaged wing scraped against the metal. Mara barely waited for the engines to cool before unstrapping herself and stepping onto the ramp. The air was heavy with tension as engineers and medics rushed forward, their faces equal parts relief and fear. "Colonel," a familiar voice called. Hector jogged to catch up with her, his face pale but resolute. "The charges worked. The Void Spire's debris is scattering all over the Atlantic, but it's not enough," Mara finished for him. Her tone clipped. She could feel the weight of the war pressing down harder than ever. "We slowed them, but we didn't stop them." Hector hesitated, his voice lowering. "We lost Lyra. Without her knowledge of the Elethran systems, it's going to be harder to decipher any more of their tech." Mara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the grief sink in. Lyra had been an unexpected ally. Her quiet strength a reminder that even the Elethrans had their fighters willing to sacrifice everything. But there was no time to mourn. Not now. She knew the risks. Mara said finally, "We honor her by making sure that sacrifice wasn't wasted." The crowd in the hangar parted as Sareth approached, his polished armor gleaming even in the dim light. His expression was impassive, but there was a sharpness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "Colonel Voss," he said, his voice measured, "your team succeeded where many would have failed. The Spire's destruction has disrupted the Wraith command network." "Disrupted isn't the same as defeated," Mara replied, her tone cutting. Sareth inclined his head. "No, it is not. But it has given us a tactical advantage, one we must capitalize on." Mara's lips tightened. "Then what's next?" Hours later, Mara sat at a war table in the main command center, surrounded by maps, holographic projections, and scattered data pads. Hector and several senior officers pored over intelligence reports while Sareth stood to the side, silent but watchful. "The Wraith are regrouping faster than anticipated," one of the officers said, pointing to a map showing clusters of red marks. "Their hive ships are spreading out across the Pacific, but their movements suggest they're protecting something." "Another node?" Hector asked, leaning in closer. "Unlikely," Sareth interjected. "The Spire was unique. Its loss is catastrophic for the Wraith, but their adaptability is unparalleled. They will change tactics." Mara tapped her fingers against the table, deep in thought. "If they're shifting focus, it's because they have something else planned, something bigger." Hector frowned, glancing at Sareth. "Wouldn't your people know what that is?" Sareth's expression tightened, the first sign of discomfort Mara had seen from him. The Graith are not an enemy we fully understand. Their evolution is erratic, convenient. Mara muttered under her breath. Before Sareth could reply, a sharp alarm blared through the command center. Everyone froze, the tension snapping into action as a voice came over the intercom. Enemy activity detected. All personnel to defensive positions. Mara grabbed her rifle, motioning for Hector to follow. Let's go. The stronghold was chaos. Soldiers scrambled to man the barricades as the Graith swarmed toward the perimeter. This wasn't a massive assault. It was smaller, more surgical, but no less deadly. Mara sprinted to the front line, her heart pounding. She spotted the Graith drones skittering across the rubble-strewn battlefield, their movements faster and more deliberate than before. These weren't mindless attackers. They were hunters. "Focus fire," she shouted, her rifle kicking against her shoulder as she fired into the oncoming horde. "Don't let them breach the line." The air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the high-pitched screeches of the Graith. Mara fought alongside her soldiers, her every motion precise, her focus unshakable. But even as the drones fell, more took their place. To her left, Sareth moved with calculated efficiency, his crystalline blade slicing through drones with practiced ease. For all his arrogance, there was no denying his skill. "They're testing us," Sareth said, his voice calm even in the heat of battle. "This is a probing attack. Then we'd better make it hurt," Mara replied, unloading another clip into a charging drone. A loud explosion rocked the barricade as a Graith war beast leapt into the fray, its claws tearing through steel and stone like paper. Soldiers scattered, their lines threatening to collapse. "Hector," Mara yelled into her comm. "We need fire support now." "On it," Hector's voice crackled back. Moments later, a rocket launcher fired from the ridge above, the projectile striking the war beast square in the chest. The explosion sent it crashing to the ground, but the breach in the barricade was already made. Drones poured through the gap, their chittering cries filling the air. Mara grabbed a fallen soldier's grenade launcher, firing into the breach with ruthless precision. "Hold the line," she shouted, her voice raw. The fight raged on for what felt like hours, but gradually, the swarm began to thin. Finally, as the last drone fell, silence returned to the battlefield. The cost was evident. Dozens of soldiers lay dead or injured, the barricades reduced to rubble. Mara stood amidst the carnage, her rifle hanging loosely at her side. Her chest heaved with exhaustion, her mind racing. "This was just the beginning," Sareth said, stepping beside her. "They are learning, adapting." Mara clenched her fists. "So are we." She turned to her remaining officers, her voice steady despite the weight of the losses. "We need to regroup, fortify our defenses, and find out what the hell the Graith are protecting." As the sun set over the ruined stronghold, Mara knew one thing with chilling certainty. The next battle would decide everything. The Graith weren't just evolving, they were preparing, and humanity would have to evolve faster if they had any hope of surviving. The aftermath of the Graith attack left the stronghold eerily quiet. Engineers worked around the clock, welding reinforcements onto what was left of the barricades. Medics scrambled to stabilize the wounded, while soldiers, battered and exhausted, watched the horizon with wary eyes. Mara sat in the dimly lit command center, reviewing the latest intelligence reports. Despite their best efforts, they still didn't have a clear picture of the Graith's next move. Hector stood beside her, scrolling through intercepted transmissions from orbital satellites. "Here," Hector said, zooming in on a grainy image of a massive structure rising out of the Pacific Ocean. "This is what the drones were guarding." Mara leaned in, her brow furrowing. The structure resembled the void spire they'd destroyed, but it was larger, almost grotesquely so. Tendrils of organic material stretched outward, connecting to smaller satellite nodes that pulsed with faint green light. "What are we looking at?" Mara asked. Hector's face was pale. "Best guess? It's a hive nexus, bigger than anything we've seen before. If this thing finishes forming, it could control every Graith on the planet and spawn new ones at an insane rate." Mara felt a chill run down her spine. "How long do we have?" Hector hesitated. 12 hours, maybe less." The room fell silent. 12 hours wasn't enough time to mount a full-scale assault, not with the stronghold still reeling from the last attack. But doing nothing wasn't an option. We need to hit it now, Mara said, her tone firm. Sareth stepped forward from the shadows, his presence commanding. An assault on the Nexus would be suicide. You lack the firepower. And you're going to tell me your fancy ships can't help, Mara snapped, glaring at him. Sareth didn't flinch. The Nexus is likely shielded by the same organic matrix as the Void Spire. Our weapons would be ineffective. Mara clenched her fists, forcing herself to think. Then we don't attack it directly. We disable it. If it's drawing power from those satellite nodes, we take those out first. Hector nodded slowly. If we knock out enough of the nodes, it might destabilize the entire structure. Sareth arched a silvery eyebrow. Your plan is reckless. It's a plan, Mara shot back. Unless you've got a better idea. Sareth's silence was answer enough. 3 hours later, 2 strike teams prepared to depart. Mara led one, while Sareth reluctantly agreed to command the other. Their mission was simple but perilous. Destroy as many satellite nodes as possible before the Graith could react. Mara's team boarded a battered human dropship, its hull patched together with scavenged parts. The interior was cramped, the smell of oil and sweat filling the air. Hector sat across from her, his face pale but determined. You good? Mara asked, her voice steady despite the tension. Hector nodded. Yeah, just wondering if I should have brought my will. Save the humor for after we survive, Mara said, managing a faint smile. The dropship shuddered as it took off, its engines straining against the weight of the mission. Through the cockpit window, Mara could see the distant glow of the Hive Nexus on the horizon, its pulsating light casting an ominous reflection across the ocean. The first node was located on a rocky island, surrounded by jagged cliffs and treacherous waves. As the dropship hovered overhead, Mara's team rappelled down, their boots landing with muffled thuds on the damp ground. The node loomed before them, a massive, bulbous structure pulsating with green energy. Drones scuttled across its surface, their movements erratic and mechanical. Take them out quietly, Mara whispered, signaling for her team to spread out. Hector worked quickly, rigging explosives to the base of the node while Mara and the others provided cover. The drones were relentless, but their movement seemed distracted, disorganized. It was as if the hive was stretching itself too thin. Charges are set, Hector called, retreating from the node. Fall back, Mara ordered. The team scrambled to the extraction point, the first explosion lighting up the sky behind them. The node disintegrated in a shower of sparks and organic matter, its tendrils slumping lifelessly to the ground. One down, Mara muttered, her voice grim. 9 more to go. Sareth's team wasn't as fortunate. Their mission to destroy a node on the mainland quickly devolved into chaos as the Graith swarmed their position. Despite his soldiers' advanced weapons and training, the sheer number of drones overwhelmed them. Sareth fought with a calculated fury, his crystalline blade cutting through drones with lethal precision. But for every drone he felled, 3 more took its place. Commander, one of his soldiers called, his voice panicked. We're being overrun. Sareth glanced at the explosives planted near the node. They weren't armed yet. With a grim determination, he made his decision. Fall back, he ordered. I will finish this. But that is an order, Sareth snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. As his soldiers retreated, Sareth charged toward the node, activating the explosives manually. The drones swarmed him, their claws tearing into his armor, but he didn't stop. With one final strike, he drove his blade into the node's core. The explosion lit up the night, the force of the blast sending shockwaves through the surrounding area. Sareth's soldiers watched from a safe distance, their expressions grim. He did it, one of them whispered. But at what cost? Back at the stronghold, Mara's team returned battered but victorious. They had destroyed 3 nodes, each loss weakening the Hive Nexus's defenses. But the cost had been high. 2 soldiers dead, and Hector nursing a nasty gash across his arm. As Mara stepped off the dropship, she was greeted by one of Sareth's officers. The Illithran's expression was unreadable. Commander Sareth's team succeeded, he said. But he did not return. Mara felt a pang of guilt. Despite their differences, Sareth had been a vital ally. His loss left a void that wouldn't be easily filled. We'll honor him by finishing what he started, Mara said, her voice firm. How many nodes are left? 4, the officer replied. Mara nodded, her resolve hardening. Then we hit them tomorrow. This ends now. As the Nexus continued to glow ominously on the horizon, Mara knew the final battle was approaching. The Graith were wounded, but they weren't defeated, and humanity's survival would come down to a fight they couldn't afford to lose. The stronghold buzzed with activity as preparations for the final assault moved into full swing. Every remaining soldier, engineer, and medic worked with single-minded determination, knowing that the next mission would either end the war or humanity. Mara stood at the center of the chaos, issuing orders with a steady voice. Her exhaustion was palpable, but she refused to let it show. The mission was clear: destroy the final 4 nodes before the Hive Nexus reached full activation. Status? Mara asked, glancing at Hector, who stood beside a console with a grim expression. We're outfitting the dropships with heavier armor, he replied, his voice tight. But it's a patch job at best. If the Graith concentrate fire, we won't last long out there. Mara nodded. We won't give them the chance. The nodes are close enough to hit in quick succession. We move fast, hit hard, and get out before they can react. Hector hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Mara, what if this doesn't work? What if we don't get all the nodes in time? Her jaw tightened. Then we keep fighting, until there's nothing left of us, or them. Hector swallowed hard, nodding. Right. Before Mara could say more, a voice crackled over the comms. Colonel Voss, incoming transmission from the Elithran fleet. She turned to the comms officer. Put it through. The holographic display flickered to life, revealing an older Elithran with a stern expression. His metallic skin was tarnished in places, a testament to years of battle. I am High Commander Thaloran, the figure announced. We have received word of Commander Sarith's sacrifice. He believed in your plan. I trust you will not let his efforts be in vain. Mara straightened, meeting the commander's gaze. We won't, but we could use your help to make sure of it. Thaloran's expression didn't soften. Our fleet is en route. We will engage the Graith Hive ships to draw their attention, but the Nexus itself is your responsibility. Understood, Mara said. Good, Thaloran replied. May your savagery prove useful. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving Mara with a faint smirk. Savages, huh? She muttered. We'll see about that. The strike teams deployed under the cover of darkness. The Elithran fleet arrived moments later, their sleek ships streaking through the atmosphere and unleashing volleys of energy blasts on the Hive ships. The night sky lit up with fire and explosions as the battle raged overhead. Mara's team reached their first target, a node hidden deep within a dense jungle. The glowing structure pulsed faintly, its tendrils embedded in the earth like the roots of a monstrous tree. Stay sharp, Mara whispered, raising her rifle. They'll know we're here soon enough. The team advanced cautiously, planting explosives around the node's base. The jungle seemed eerily quiet, the usual hum of insects replaced by an oppressive stillness. It's too quiet, Hector muttered, his eyes scanning the shadows. As if on cue, the Graith emerged. They came from every direction, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. Here we go, Mara shouted, opening fire. The battle was brutal and chaotic. The team fought desperately, their weapons lighting up the jungle with every shot. Mara's rifle clicked empty, and she switched to her sidearm without missing a beat. Hector, status on the charges, she yelled. Almost there, he called back, his hands trembling as he wired the last explosive. Mara gritted her teeth, her focus narrowing as a Graith drone lunged toward Hector. She fired, the bullet striking true just inches from his head. All set, Hector shouted. Fall back, Mara ordered, her voice hoarse. The team retreated as the explosives detonated, the node erupting in a blinding explosion. The ground shook violently, and the tendrils writhed before collapsing into lifeless heaps. One down, Mara said, panting. Move to the next. The next 2 nodes were just as heavily guarded, but the teams pressed on. Each victory came at a cost. Another soldier lost, another wound that slowed them down. By the time they reached the final node, Mara's team was battered and bloodied. The last node was located on a rocky plateau, its glow casting eerie shadows across the jagged terrain. The Graith swarmed around it in endless waves, their chittering cries filling the air. "We're outnumbered," Hector said, his voice shaking. "We're always outnumbered," Mara replied, gripping her rifle. "We finish this." The final assault was chaos incarnate. Mara and her team fought with everything they had, their movements fueled by desperation and determination. Hector planted the last set of charges, his hands slick with blood from a gash on his arm. "Get clear," he shouted, sprinting toward the extraction point. Mara covered their retreat, her rifle barking in rapid bursts. The drones swarmed her, their claws grazing her armor, but she didn't falter. "Colonel!" Hector yelled. Mara turned and ran, her legs burning as the charges detonated behind her. The explosion was deafening, the shockwave sending her sprawling to the ground. When she looked up, the node was gone, its remains scattered across the plateau. "It's done," Hector said, his voice filled with relief. Mara pushed herself to her feet, her body aching. "Not yet," she said, staring toward the horizon. In the distance, the hive nexus pulsed erratically, its once steady glow faltering. The destruction of the nodes was taking its toll, but the nexus wasn't defeated yet. "Get back to the stronghold," Mara ordered. "We're finishing this." Hector hesitated. "Mara." "Go," she said firmly. As Hector and the others boarded the dropship, Mara stared at the distant nexus, her jaw tightening. This was it. The final gambit. One last fight to end the war. With a deep breath, she turned toward the horizon and began her march. The sky was a battlefield of fire and steel. The Elithran fleet engaged the Graith hive ships in a deadly dance above Earth, their weapons lighting up the heavens in brilliant flashes. Below, the battered remnants of humanity's forces prepared for the final push. The nexus loomed in the distance, its pulsing light erratic, each flicker a sign that the destruction of its nodes had weakened it. But not enough. Mara led the ground team, her rifle slung across her back and her movements deliberate. Beside her, Hector limped slightly, his arm hastily bandaged. Around them, soldiers readied their weapons, their faces a mix of fear and determination. They all knew this could be their last battle, but none of them faltered. "The Nexus is vulnerable," Mara said, her voice carrying across the group. "But it's not out of the fight. We're going in to finish the job, plant the charges at the core, blow it to hell, and get out. You've seen what these things can do, so stay sharp." Hector cleared his throat, stepping forward. "And remember, the Graith are going to throw everything they've got at us. Stick to the plan, and we might just survive this." "Any questions?" Mara asked, scanning the group. The silence was answer enough. "Good," she said. "Let's move." The approach to the Nexus was a gauntlet. The ground beneath their feet turned from soil to a sickly organic substance, pulsating faintly as if alive. Graith drones swarmed out of hidden tunnels, their movements frantic but relentless. "Watch the flanks!" Mara shouted, firing into a cluster of drones as they burst from the ground. Beside her, Hector threw a grenade, the explosion sending chitinous limbs flying. "They're fighting harder," Hector said, reloading his rifle. "It's like they know we're close." "They do," Mara replied grimly. "The hive always knows." The team pressed on, their numbers dwindling with every step. A war beast roared as it barreled into their path, its claws tearing through two soldiers before they managed to bring it down with concentrated fire. Every victory came with a cost, but there was no turning back. As they reached the base of the Nexus, Mara paused, taking in the grotesque structure. It towered over them, its organic tendrils reaching deep into the earth. The air was thick with a foul stench, and the pulsing light from the core bathed the area in an eerie green glow. "This is it," she said. "Hector, get the charges ready. Everyone else, form a perimeter." The team moved into position, their weapons trained on the darkness. Hector worked quickly, his hands steady, despite the chaos around him. "Colonel," a soldier called out, panic in his voice. "We've got movement. Big movement." Mara turned to see a massive Graith creature emerging from the Nexus. It was unlike anything they'd seen before. Towering, serpentine, its body covered in a shifting armor of chitin and glowing veins of energy. Its head was crowned with jagged spines, and its eyes burned with an unnatural light. "What the hell is that?" Hector whispered. "The Guardian." Sareth's voice echoed in her mind, a memory from their earlier conversations. "The Nexus core is always protected by a hive guardian." Mara clenched her jaw. "Keep it busy. Hector, you finish the charges." The Guardian let out an ear-splitting roar and lunged toward the team. Mara and the others opened fire, their bullets ricocheting off its armor. It moved with terrifying speed, its tail sweeping through their ranks and sending soldiers flying. "Fall back! Spread out!" Mara shouted, firing at the creature's glowing veins. The shots didn't seem to slow it down. The Guardian's claws smashed into the ground, narrowly missing Mara. She rolled to the side and raised her rifle, aiming for its eyes. A single shot hit true, and the creature roared in pain, thrashing wildly. "That got its attention," Hector called, still wiring the charges. "Good," Mara replied. "Keep hitting it." The remaining soldiers focused their fire on the Guardian, aiming for its glowing weak points. Lethal as it was, the creature was slow to adapt, its rage making it reckless. "Hector, status!" Mara yelled, dodging another swipe from the creature's tail. "Almost there," he shouted. "Just a few more seconds." The Guardian reared back, its spines glowing brighter as energy built up in its core. Mara's eyes widened in realization. "It's charging an attack." "Scatter!" The team dove for cover as the Guardian unleashed a devastating beam of energy, scorching the ground and obliterating a cluster of nearby drones. The air sizzled with heat, and the ground beneath Mara's feet cracked and splintered. "Hector, now would be a great time," she yelled. "Done," Hector shouted, pulling back from the charges. "It's armed. Fall back," Mara ordered. "Everyone, move." The team retreated as the charges began to tick down. The Guardian roared, turning its attention to the explosives. It lunged toward the core, its massive body coiling protectively around the Nexus. The explosion came seconds later, a blinding flash of light that lit up the battlefield. The shockwave knocked Mara off her feet, and for a moment, everything went silent. When she opened her eyes, the Nexus was gone. The tendrils were reduced to ash, and the Guardian lay motionless, its body shattered. Around her, the surviving soldiers were picking themselves up, their faces etched with disbelief. "We did it," Hector said, his voice barely a whisper. "We actually did it." Mara pulled herself to her feet, her body aching. She looked toward the horizon where the hive ships in the sky were beginning to falter, their movements erratic. The Nexus's destruction had severed their connection to the hive mind. "It's not over yet," she said, her voice firm, "but we just took their head off. Now let's finish the body." The team regrouped, battered but victorious. The war wasn't won, but for the first time, they had a fighting chance. As the fires of the Nexus burned out, Mara allowed herself a moment of hope. Humanity wasn't done yet. The hive ships faltered, their once coordinated movements unraveling into disarray. Graith drones on the surface spasmed erratically, some collapsing mid-charge as the destruction of the Nexus severed their connection to the hive mind. Across the battlefield, the tide was turning. From her vantage point on the ridge, Mara watched the scene unfold. Smoke and fire filled the air, but for the first time, there was a sense of triumph. Soldiers who had been fighting with grim resignation now surged forward with renewed vigor, cutting down the disoriented drones. "We've got them on the ropes," Hector said, limping up beside her. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat, but his eyes were bright with hope. Mara nodded, her grip on her rifle tightening. The Nexus was their control hub. Without it, they're vulnerable. "But we can't stop now." Her comm crackled, and a familiar voice came through. "Colonel Voss, this is High Commander Thaloran. We have pushed the hive ships into retreat, but several remain in orbit. Your actions have impressed us." Mara smirked, wiping blood from her cheek. "That almost sounds like a compliment." "Thaloran." There was a brief pause. "Do not let it go to your head. The Graith are still a threat, but for now, your people have proven formidable savages," Mara muttered to herself, shaking her head. "Thaloran," she said aloud, "can your fleet take out the remaining hive ships if we clear the surface?" "Yes," he replied, "but only if your forces can prevent further launches from the planet." destroy their remaining ground forces, and we will finish the job." "Understood," Mara said. "Let's end this." The next hours were a blur of relentless fighting. Mara led the charge across the battlefield, coordinating strikes against the remaining Graith strongholds. Every step forward felt like clawing through the jaws of death, but humanity's forces refused to yield. The Elithran fleet played its part, raining fire from the skies and intercepting Graith reinforcements before they could reach the surface. It was a fragile, uneasy alliance, but it was holding. At one point, Hector turned to Mara, his voice shaking with exhaustion. "Do you think this is it?" The final push? Mara didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "It has to be. We don't have anything left to give." She was right. Their ammunition was running low, and the soldiers were battered beyond measure. But every person on that battlefield knew that giving up wasn't an option. As the sun began to rise, the final Graith nest came into view. A sprawling, pulsating structure nestled in the remains of a ruined city. The team paused, taking in the grotesque sight. "This is it," Mara said, her voice firm. "One last fight." Hector looked at her, his expression grim. "You ever think about what happens after this? If we actually win?" Mara allowed herself a faint smile. "One problem at a time." The assault on the nest was ferocious. Drones poured out of the structure in waves, their numbers seemingly endless, but they lacked the coordination and precision they'd once had. Humanity pushed forward, every soldier fighting as if their life depended on it. Because it did. Mara fought at the front, her rifle emptying clip after clip. She barely registered the chaos around her, her focus entirely on the goal. "Keep moving," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. The Elithran forces joined the fray, their advanced weaponry carving through the disorganized drones. Thalarin himself descended to the battlefield, his presence inspiring a mix of awe and determination among the troops. Finally, Mara and her team reached the core of the nest. It was a massive, writhing mass of organic tendrils, glowing faintly with the remnants of the hive's power. "Hector, set the charges," Mara ordered. Hector hesitated, his hands shaking as he reached for his equipment. "This feels too easy," he said. "Where's the—" Before he could finish, the ground trembled. From the depths of the nest emerged another guardian, this one even larger and more terrifying than the one at the Nexus. Its body glowed with volatile energy, and its roar shook the very air. "Figures," Mara muttered, raising her rifle. "Light it up." The final battle was chaos. The guardian lashed out with claws and tendrils, its movements faster and more aggressive than anything they'd faced before. Mara's team fought with everything they had, but the creature seemed unstoppable. "We can't hold it," Hector shouted, firing a grenade that barely slowed the beast. "We don't have to," Mara said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Just long enough to finish the job. She grabbed the detonator from Hector's belt and ran toward the core, dodging the Guardian's attacks by sheer instinct. "Mara, no!" Hector yelled. "Keep it busy," she shouted, not looking back. Reaching the core, she slammed the charges into place and armed them. The Guardian turned toward her, its glowing eyes locking onto its target. Mara stood her ground, gripping the detonator tightly. "Come on, you bastard," she muttered. The creature lunged, and she hit the button. The explosion was blinding, a massive shockwave tearing through the nest and obliterating the core. The Guardian let out a final piercing roar before collapsing into lifeless chunks of smoldering flesh. When the dust settled, Mara lay motionless, her body battered and bloodied. She coughed, her vision swimming as Hector and the others ran toward her. "We did it," Hector said, his voice choked with emotion. "It's over." Mara managed a faint smile. "Damn right. We did." The aftermath was surreal. The remaining hive ships fell silent, drifting aimlessly before being destroyed by the Elithran fleet. The Graith were defeated, their once unstoppable tide broken. Thalarin approached Mara as she stood overlooking the battlefield, her arm in a sling. "Colonel Voss," he said, his tone respectful, "your people have shown remarkable resilience." "Perhaps I underestimated humanity," Mara smirked. "You're not the first. You won't be the last." He nodded, a faint smile on his lips. May this victory mark the beginning of a stronger alliance. As the Elethrans departed, Mara turned to Hector and the remaining soldiers. The cost had been high, but they had survived. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel like a death sentence. It felt like a promise. And humanity, the so-called savages, had earned their place among the stars.